We are going to move from ancient China now to ancient Greece and look at another empiricist who approaches ethics in a way that is, in a lot of respects, very, very similar to Confucius. That person is Aristotle. Now, it's a little strange to start talking about Aristotle. He's the third in the famous sequence of Greek philosophers. Socrates began a certain tradition. He wrote nothing, but he appears as a character in the dialogues of Plato. Plato was his student. Plato started a school of philosophy known as the Academy. And then his most illustrious student was Aristotle, who started another school, the Lyceum. And so Aristotle sort of comes third in that tradition. Well, if Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, who did Aristotle teach? Who's the really famous person that Aristotle was the teacher of? Alexander the Great, exactly. He didn't write philosophy, he just conquered the known world. But anyway, Aristotle lays out a comprehensive system of ethics that is still one of the main approaches to ethical theory. There are a lot of contemporary people who identify with some modern figures, but I would say still maybe a fourth of the ethics, the people who work in ethics now identify themselves as Aristotelians and take a basically Aristotelian approach to ethics. So it's still a very live way of thinking about ethical problems. Aristotle starts with a basic distinction that I think is a valuable distinction, whatever view you have. It's the distinction between instrumental goods and intrinsic goods. An instrumental good is something that is good for the sake of something else. It's an instrument, it's a tool, it's useful for doing something. It's not that you value it for its own sake so much. You really want it as a way of accomplishing something else. You care about it because you care about something else. An intrinsic good is not like that. An intrinsic good is something you value for its own sake. It might bring benefits, but even if it didn't, even if it wasn't good for anything else, you would still think it's valuable for its own sake, in its own right. So, let's start with the easy question. What are some examples of instrumental goods? Things that are good for the sake of something else. Yeah.
Currency.
Good currency, money. Okay, I had a very close friend in junior high school, and college. His father used to say, I don't care about money, I just care about the things money can buy. And that was his way of, well, at least how I interpreted it was, money is a purely instrumental good. It's something that gets you other things. It's not something you typically value for its own sake. You value it for the sake of what it can give. What are some other things that are good instrumentally like that? Yeah. Tools, good. Hammers, nails, keys. A key is good for what it can do. It's not as if I say, whoa, what's that the key to? And I say, oh, I don't know, I just carry it. It's good for doing certain things. That's why keys matter. Other things that are instrumental goods. Yeah.
Voters.
Voters. Whoa. I suppose if you're a politician, and a rather nasty politician, you might think that voters are merely means to an end, means to the end of your staying in office. Now that actually raises a really interesting question. Can other people be mere instruments for you? We're going to come back to that question when we get to the ethical system of Immanuel Kant, because one way of putting his basic principle of ethics is you're never supposed to treat another rational agent as a mere means to your own ends. You're supposed to be respecting them as an end in themselves. Yeah?
Medicine.
Medicine, good. Medicine is a tool for achieving health. It's an instrumental good. Every morning I give my cat an antibiotic because he's been sick. That is something that is an instrumental good. It's certainly not intrinsically valuable. It's not like I think, oh yeah, this Ormax is just cool for its own sake. And the cat certainly does not enjoy it. It's not like, oh, we just enjoy this little ritual for its own sake. No, this is something that is a means to an end. So it's an instrumental good. Yes?
When we say goods, are we talking about specifically items? Like an action as well, or what?
Okay, good. This is meant to be very, very broad. So it could be a specific thing like a particular medicine or a particular bit of currency, but it could also be an idea, it could be an experience, it could be an event or an action of some kind. So what did you have in mind?
I was thinking like a revolution, or like fighting would be an instrumental good.
Good, a revolution or fighting in general is generally an instrumental good. War is an instrumental good. It's supposed to actually accomplish something. It's not something pursued for its own sake. And lots of things less dramatic than that. Brushing your teeth is something that is an instrumental good. It's not something, suppose somebody found out that brushing your teeth is actually harmful. I would stop it, right? I wouldn't say, oh, but I just really enjoy doing it for its own sake. And so things like that, activities of that kind, are things that generally are instruments for accomplishing something else, not valued for their own sakes. Yes?
Did you say that an intrinsic good is like education? Because I don't really want to be a philosophy major. I actually want to be a lawyer.
Oh, okay. Education, knowledge. That's going to fall into the category of things that, in a way, could be either one, right? There are certain things I want to know purely because they gain me something else. There are other things I want to know for their own sake. So, for example, there might be some things that you really do value knowing purely instrumental, purely because it's a means to an end. So maybe for you, philosophy is one of those. It's not for me, obviously. I love doing this, and I do it for its own sake. But it could be the kind of thing that for you isn't like that. It's a means to an end for you. You don't really enjoy doing it for its own sake. And for me, there are lots of kinds of knowledge that are like that. I have to know how to fill out tax forms. This is merely an instrument for staying out of trouble with the government. I do not enjoy it. In fact, I hate it. There are very few things that make me utter profanities. One is severe physical injury, and the other is filling out tax forms. Okay? Knowing how to do that for me is purely an instrumental good. It is not something I would ever want to know for its own sake. But there are things. Now, what are some things that you might actually want to know for their own sakes?
Truth.
The truth. It might be that you really care about the truth independently of what it could do for you. For example, suppose I say, well, listen, it'll work out really well for you if you believe this, even though it's not true. You might think, but wait, I want to know what's really right. I want to know what's true. And you might value the truth for its own sake.
Development of a skill for a musical instrument and work.
Wonderful, okay? Developing the skill to play a musical instrument. That is something you might just enjoy for its own sake. Now, maybe not. Maybe it's the kind of thing that you have to actually do for some reason. You're a member of the symphony orchestra, let's say, and all of a sudden there's a piece that requires mastery of some instrument, and nobody else knows how to play it, and you're the closest one. All right, for this piece. Actually, I read about a new musical instrument today. It's called the dill piccolo. And it was somebody just made a pickle look like a flute. And it plays only sour notes. Well, there are actually occasions like this, right? There's a composition by John Cage, I think, that has you take nuts and bolts and put them inside a piano.
Yeah.
Right? And learning how to play that and make those sounds with the piano is something you might not really enjoy doing. It's just that you do it instrumentally, as it were, for that. Sort of pun on instrument there. But you might really just love playing a musical instrument. I love playing the piano, and I would do it even if it was no good to me at all to do it. It's something I take pleasure in for its own sake. Yeah?
Knowing like basic healing processes, just in case there's ever an emergency or something you need to do for yourself, like if you're ever sick or if someone near you is sick.
Okay, good. Knowing CPR, knowing something about first aid, that might be an instrumental good, something that you value knowing because of what it can do in case there's an emergency or somebody's in trouble. You could, of course, just think, oh, this is cool, I'm glad I know it. And I would want to know it even if it did nothing for me. But for most people, at least, that would be an instrumental bit of knowledge. Yeah?
Ice cream?
Oh, ice cream. Is that an instrumental good or an intrinsic good? Is it you might say tofu is an instrumental sort of good, unless you just love the taste of tofu. But ice cream, a lot of people would say that's something you value for its own sake. In fact, one time, a philosopher put on her blog the question of what are some things you value for their own sakes? And my answer was a Southside shake. Okay? And it's something that is still sold at an ice cream shop near where I grew up. It's on Pittsburgh's south side, and in Pittsburgh you don't say south side, you say south side. And this is called a Southside shake. What is it? It is it's a milkshake, a really thick milkshake. topped with an ice cream sundae. Okay? Any flavors you want. So I like to get a really thick chocolate shake topped with a peanut butter sundae. It's like 1,000,000 calories. Okay? But it's the best thing ever. It's unbelievably good. And that's something I value for its own sake. The experience of eating a sasai shake is like, what does it do for me? Well, this, right? But that's not something I desire. And so it's something that I eat despite its, being an instrument toward getting fat. Yeah.
Wouldn't your outside shake be an instrumental good because it brings you happiness?
Now, yes, you might say, well, wait, that's an instrument toward pleasure or happiness, isn't it? And so maybe it is actually an instrument for that. Now, it is often true that something we value for its own sake is also an instrument for something else. That is to say, we shouldn't think there are two kinds of goods, one kind instrumental and one kind intrinsic. Really, these overlap. Okay? Lots of things, yes, there, they overlap. Some things fall into the middle. They're often valued both for their own sake and for the sake of something else. And I think of a lot of pleasurable experiences as being like that. I value the experience for its own sake, but also for the sake of the pleasure or happiness that it brings. Yeah?
I was thinking like religion will be kind of both, because at the same time you can do what you want to, but you also do something else.
Good. So religion might be a similar kind of thing. You might value it for its own sake because of because you find the expression, let's say, of worship valuable. But you might also value it because you think of it as an instrument to something else. Maybe to a certain state of mind, maybe to getting into heaven, maybe to achieving a kind of relationship with God or with other people or a kind of self-knowledge. Whatever your particular version of spirituality is, often a religious practice is something that is valued for both reasons. It's both an instrument and is valued for its own sake. Yeah?
Having a pet?
Having a pet.
Yeah.
Yes, having a pet is something that is often valued for its own sake. Why does somebody want a dog? You might want a dog to be a guard dog, for example, or to actually be a working dog on your ranch to help you keep track of the sheep. But you might want, if it's really a pet, to just have the companionship of the dog. And so that's something that is valued for its own sake. I have cats. And I have yet to figure out what these cats are good for. So right now I'm not seeing a lot of instrumental value to this, but I value their presence for its own sake. Yeah?
Driving like a really nice car, because it's a tool to get you somewhere, but it's also enjoyable to speed in it or to just sit in that luxury.
Excellent. Okay, good. Driving is something that is often both kinds of goods. You drive in order to get somewhere, and so it's an instrument for that, but you might really enjoy driving. Or maybe it's driving that particular car. I sort of enjoy driving no matter what the car is, but I do have a Miata, and driving a Miata is fun for its own sake. I would want to drive it even if I had nowhere to go, because it's just fun to drive. I value it for its own sake. And so that's something that sort of, for a lot of people, falls into both categories. But of course, it could be just one. It could be that, no, I don't enjoy driving. For me, it's merely a means to get somewhere. That would be valuing it merely as an instrumental good. Or you might be somebody who has nowhere to go. And you think, yeah, gosh, I just value it for its own sake. Maybe you're like a little kid who has a toy car and you just ride it around this track. You value the experience for its own sake. It's not because you're going anywhere. Yeah?
Smoking cigarettes?
Smoking cigarettes. Is that something people do for the sake of something else, or do they do it for its own sake? I don't know. Never having smoked, I'm not sure, but I suspect for a lot of people it's something in between. I had a friend who was constantly trying to give up smoking when he was around here. He would tend to succeed when he was at UT because not many people smoke around here. And then he would go to Europe for a year and come back smoking again. And now he's in Europe permanently, and I think permanently smoking again. But he did value the experience for its own sake, but partly also for the sake of the nicotine, partly because it made him lose weight when he was smoking. When he was giving it up, he would be covered in nicotine patches. In the morning he'd start with one, be like, yeah, that's not doing it, so here's another. And by the end of the day, he looked like he had caught the measles in a really large stage form. So I think for him, it fell into that category of both. It was an experience he enjoyed, but also it was for the sake of something else. Now, Aristotle's question is, are there things that are always valued for their own sakes and never for the sake of something else? Something we never say, oh yeah, and this is good for this sort of thing too, like driving or knowledge or all sorts of things might be in that category where it can be both valued for its own sake and for the sake of something else. Are there things that are always valued purely for their own sake, never for the sake of something else?
Happiness?
Happiness, that is his answer. He says there is only one thing that is really what he calls a final good. A final good being intrinsic, always intrinsic, never instrumental. And that, he says, is happiness. We call final, without qualification, that which is always desirable in itself and never for the sake of something else. And there's only one thing like that, he thinks. It's a useful exercise to think, really, is he right about happiness, first of all, but secondly, are there others? But he says there's only one thing, always desired for its own sake, never for the sake of something else, namely happiness. Well, what is happiness? Yes, he says, we never choose it for the sake of something else. Happiness, above all else, is held to be like this. We choose it always for itself, never for the sake of something else. But there are lots of things that fall into that middle category. So honor, pleasure, reason, every virtue we choose, indeed for themselves, but also for the sake of happiness, judging that by means of them we'll be happy. Happiness nobody chooses for the sake of those, nor in general for anything other than itself. So if let's say you would like to become a more honest person. And I say, well, why? Why do you value honesty? And you say, well, I think it's good in itself to be honest. But you might say, but also, I want to gain the trust of other people. I want to deserve the trust of other people. I think I'll get along with other people better if I'm more honest with them. I think I'll also be more honest with myself, and that will let me lead a better life. And so I value honesty. Notice what the person will be saying, both for its own sake, but also because I think it'll give me better relationships with other people, better understanding of myself. I will lead a better life. I will be happier if I am an honest person. And that sort of person is saying, I value honesty, both for its own sake and for the sake of something else. But you say in the end, okay, so I think I'm going to be happier if I'm an honest person. And I say, well, why do you want to be happy? It would be very strange, wouldn't it, say, why do I want to be happy? Well, I read this survey that said happier people are richer. So I figure it's a good way to make money to be happier. That would be really weird, right? For one thing, I'd say, well, why do you want to be richer? The obvious answer would be, well, I think I'll be happier. If that's not the answer, what could it be, right? So it would be very odd to say, I want to be happy for some other reason. We'd say, why do you want that? And in the end, Aristotle would say, it always has to come back to happiness. That, he thinks, is really the one final good. Now, are there other things that could be like this? Are there things he's leaving out? Notice he doesn't give us an argument that it's the only one. He says it's like this, and I think that's a very plausible claim. But you might think, well, are there other things like this too? Is there anything else that people always value for its own sake and never for the sake of something else? Yeah?
Confucius might say Ren.
Okay, Confucius might say Ren, virtue. But now, could one value virtue for being a good person in general, let's say, for the sake of something else? Yeah?
Revenge?
Revenge! Living well is the best revenge. I mean, suppose you did. You said, all right, I grew up in rough circumstances. There were a lot of vicious people around me. You know what? I'm not going to be like that. And part of my revenge against those people and what they did to me is that I'm going to rise above that and be a better person. That would be a plausible sort of psychological account. This person values virtue for the sake of revenge, for the sake of showing those other people there's a better way to live. It's like, nana boo-boo, I don't have to be like you. And that's something that's sort of a plausible account. That would be valuing virtue for the sake of something else, not for the sake of itself. Yeah?
Could you use the same scenario for discrediting happiness? Because someone could want to be happy just so someone, say,
right.
Someone sees them happy and they get upset. They're being happy to make that person.
That's right. Okay, yes. Why couldn't we do the same thing with happiness? So, somebody you care about a great deal breaks up with you and says, look, you're just, you get depressed sometimes and it just drags me down and I don't want to live this way. And so he or she breaks up with you and you're very sad. And then you think, well, I'm going to show them. I'm going to show them. I'm not going to be unhappy. I'm not going to be depressed. I'm going to be the happiest person you ever saw. And I'm going to put it on Facebook all the time. So it's like, yeah, why couldn't you do that? That would be happiness for the sake of something else. Now, I think Aristotle would say, but wait, okay, you say, so I'm showing you, right? I'm getting my revenge. I'm living well. I'm happy. Why do you want to display, why do you want that kind of revenge? Now, Aristotle thinks you're going to say, kids, it'll make me happy, right? Be vengeful in that way. But it's supposed to say, no, I just value revenge for its own sake. I mean, somebody hits me, I punch him back. It's like, it's not because it makes me happy, it's just because vengeance is good. Vengeance is mine, saith the Daniel. If that's really the way you think. Now, I think underlying this, Aristotle's making a psychological claim. He's saying, yeah, it could be like that, but he doesn't think people are really like that. People value that because it's going to make them happy to think they're making that other person suffer. And so it's a real claim here that he might be right or wrong about, that in the end, all of that loops back to happiness. Yes?
I would contest and maybe say that security is another final good.
Ooh, what about security? Okay, I want security. In fact, I have this little app now that shows me every day crimes that were committed in my neighborhood. I don't entirely recommend this. It's a way of being really nervous about where you live. I mean, I would have said, oh, I live in a very peaceful, safe neighborhood. And suddenly I find out, wait, just a block away, there was a theft. And a block in that direction, there was an assault. And all of a sudden I think, maybe I should move to the middle of the country somewhere. But that's the sort of thing you might think, yeah, look, I value security, right? And it's not just because it makes me happy. It's not like, and there was a day, the hurricane moved through town, where there were no crimes. Here's one way to prevent crime. Just have constant heavy rain and wind. People aren't out there committing crimes. Well, okay. Did I sort of look at that and think, yeah, it makes me happy? Not really, right? Security feels different from happiness. So I think security would actually be an excellent candidate for something people value for its own sake. Now, could they value it for the sake of something else too? Sure. I think Aristotle would say, come on, look. Part of the reason I value security is that insecurity makes me unhappy. And so it's in order to protect my happiness that I actually value security. It's a sort of negative thing, but nevertheless, it's connected to happiness, just not as purely a means to happiness. It's like the prevention of a means to unhappiness. Yeah?
What about life?
Life itself. Yes, what about that? Do we value life always for its own sake and never for the sake of something else? Yes?
Morality.
Morality. Okay, that's very similar to the question of virtue. You might think that being a moral person, doing the right thing, is to be valued for its own sake, not for the sake of something else. And indeed, we're going to look at another philosopher later, Immanuel Kant, that I think would say that's exactly right. In fact, to the extent that you're moral purely for the sake of something else, you're not being moral at all. Morality really is doing the right thing for the sake of the right thing and nothing else. And so he would agree with you. Yes?
Meaning or purpose.
Meaning and purpose. Yes, you might say, look, I want meaning in my life. I want to live for a purpose. And that's something that people always value for its own sake, not for the sake of something else. Now, you could say, again, as Aristotle, I think, well, that's a component of happiness. That's part of happiness, having a sense of purpose and achievement and meaning in your life. But that raises an interesting question. What is the relationship between happiness and a lot of these things like virtue or morality or security or meaning that allows us to explain how they connect up together? I think there's a way maybe of doing that Aristotle has in mind, though he never spells it out very explicitly. What do I mean? Well, I think he has in mind that a good life is one that includes all of those things. Happiness is something like his umbrella term for a life that does include virtue and meaning and achievement and accomplishment and security and love and a variety of other things like that. So those are maybe less means to happiness than just components of happiness, parts of happiness itself. His concept of happiness is in that way different from ours. It's a very broad concept. He says both the general run of men and people of superior refinement say that it's happiness and identifying living well and doing well with being happy. His term for this is eudaimonia in Greek, and it really means something like living well, flourishing, thriving. A friend of mine from graduate school is a philosophy professor who is an Aristotelian. I only see him a few times a decade, really, because he teaches in New York. But when I see him, he will throw open his arms like this and say, "Daniel, are you flourishing?" And he means this. He's an Aristotelian. He wrote a book on the virtues very much in the mold of Aristotle. And this is exactly what he has in mind. Are you living well? And he doesn't mean in the living well is the best revenge sense, how prosperous are you? He doesn't mean it in a sense of how are you feeling today, feeling good? He means in general, is your life going well? Are you thriving? Are you flourishing? Now, that's a very broad sort of thing. We often think of happiness as something that is very momentary, right? You go to the amusement park, have a great time. That day you're happy. The next day, oh gosh, you're kind of bored and maybe your neck is sore from riding all those coasters. You're like, yeah, I'm not so happy today. And it's kind of like the happiness chart goes like this. Aristotle's idea is much broader. Okay, he's thinking about in general how your life is going, not how you're feeling today. So this is not primarily a question of how you feel. This is a question of how you're living, how well your life is going. And that's a much broader thing. It's something that, as he says, and this was why my colleague put "one swallow doesn't make a summer" on the exam, because he's saying this is something that, in a sense, has to do with a whole life. It's a question of, is this person living well up to this point? Have they lived well once their life is over? And that's something that involves a very broad view of life as a whole, not just moment to moment. Now, what's required for living well? Suppose I were to say to you, imagine that you're at the end of your life. You are, older than me, let's say, and you're looking back on things, and you're thinking, have I lived well? What are some things that you would want to be part of your life for you to say, yes, I've lived well? Yeah.
Meaningful relationships.
Good, meaningful relationships, yeah. You would want to have friends, right? You would want to have people you loved, people who loved you. What else?
Achieving your goals.
Achieving your goals. You'd want to feel like you had purpose, you had goals, and like you had achieved something. What else?
Charitable.
That you were charitable, that you had contributed positively to the lives of people around you. What else?
Fulfilling experiences.
Fulfilling experiences. Yeah, you would want to feel like, hey, I've lived well, I did this, I did that, I feel fulfilled, I experienced lots of things.
Memorable. You want to feel memorable.
Okay, good. You'd want to feel memorable. You'd want to think that you were worth remembering. If you're there lying on your deathbed and somebody says, hey, your life hasn't been that great, but don't worry, no one will ever remember you. You're going to feel like, oh, thanks a lot, right? That's not a good thing. Other things you would want.
Security and happiness of the ones you care about.
Good. Security, not only your happiness, but the happiness of people around you. Other things. Family. Now, there are lots of components like that. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's okay. I was going to say justice because there's like a whole dialogue on
Well, all right, good. Justice. You might think, yeah, look, I would want to feel as if I had been treated fairly, as if I had treated other people fairly. If in the end you think, yes, I've lived pretty well as the leader of this large criminal enterprise, torturing, killing, running houses of prostitution, etc., you might think, yeah, that's grounds for saying I didn't live that well. Knowledge. Okay, good. You would think knowledge is a crucial component of living well. That if you died in ignorance of fundamental things, that would be a problem. So knowledge is also something you would want to be part of this. Aristotle would say happiness is really something that contributes to all of these things and includes all of these things. Now, that's going to require some internal things, some virtues on your part, but it also requires a lot of external things. It requires some level of prosperity. He says, look, you don't have to be rich to be happy, but on the other hand, you can't be starving to death and be happy. So there's some level of material comfort that's required here. There's some degree of luck. He says the person whose family is wiped out by the plague is not going to feel that they have lived well, even if it's not in any respect their fault. So, to some extent, just external circumstances have to cooperate in this. Well, What is it really to live well? And we'll close here by saying, Aristotle says, let's think about some analogies. What makes a good knife? It cuts well. What makes a good eye? It sees well. What makes a good teacher? Somebody who teaches well. Now, in every case, what's going on is that the thing that is doing its thing well, that's cutting well or teaching well or seeing well, it is fulfilling its function well. So we might say, what is it to be a good person and to live well? Well, it's to fulfill your function well. And that brings us to a deep question where we'll close today. What is the function of a human being? We know what knives are for, what eyes are for, what teachers are for. What are you for? What are human beings, just as human beings, for? What is our purpose? Next time we'll come back and consider his answer to that question.